The music had barely reached its second chorus when Aveline Cole crossed the dance floor of the Belle Horizon, grabbed Jiho Kang by the wrist, and pulled him into her arms so fast his champagne glass shattered on the teakwood deck. "Dance with me," she said, her voice low, controlled, terrifyingly calm. "Or you die in 5 minutes." For a second, Jiho Kang, 34 years old, heir to the Kang Shipping Group, a man whose face had been on the cover of Forbes Asia twice, simply stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Around them, 200 guests in silk and diamonds kept sipping their drinks, oblivious, laughing under strings of golden lights strung across the yacht's upper deck. The band kept playing. Nobody noticed. Nobody except the woman now gripping his hand like a vice, spinning him into a slow, deliberate waltz. "Let go of me," Jiho hissed through his teeth, trying to keep his smile plastered on for the cameras and the guests who might be watching. "Someone keeping you breathing," Aveline said, guiding him in a tight circle, her eyes flicking past his shoulder toward the upper railing. "There's a man on the third deck with a rifle fitted with a suppressor. He's been tracking you for the last 11 minutes. The only reason you're not dead already is because you haven't stood still long enough for a clean shot." Jiho's breath caught. He searched her face for a joke, a prank, anything. He found none. Her jaw was set, her eyes sharp as glass, and her hand at his back was steering him with the precision of someone who had done this before, more than once. "You're insane," he muttered, but his feet were already moving with hers, some instinct in him recognizing truth even as his mind rejected it. Insane would be standing still, Aveline shot back, spinning him again, putting a waiter's cart between them and the railing for a half-second of cover. "Smile. Keep smiling. Your guests are watching." He smiled. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. 3 months earlier, Aveline Cole had been sitting in a dim office in Atlanta, staring at a manila folder with a Korean shipping conglomerate's logo stamped across the top. She was 31, ex-Army CID, 2 years removed from a private security contract in Lagos, and had ended with a bullet graze on her shoulder and a healthy distrust of anyone who called himself a client. Her business partner, a wiry man named Desmond Ashworth, who ran their small executive protection firm, had slid the folder across the desk with a grim look. "Kang Shipping wants a ghost, someone who can get close to the principal without looking like security. No suits, no earpieces, no obvious tells. Someone who can blend into a party." "And why exactly does a shipping billionaire need a ghost?" Aveline had asked, flipping through surveillance photos of a handsome, sharp-jawed Korean man stepping out of black cars in Seoul, in Busan, in Singapore. "Because somebody's been feeding intel to a rival conglomerate about his movements," Desmond had said. 3 near misses in 4 months. A car that shouldn't have run that red light. A gas leak that shouldn't have happened in his penthouse. And 2 weeks ago, a shooter took a shot at his motorcade in Incheon and missed by inches. His family thinks it's internal, a mole close to him. They want someone from the outside, someone with no ties to Seoul, no ties to his circle, no reason to be suspected. Aveline had looked at the photograph of Jiho Kang one more time, the confident tilt of his chin, the exhaustion hiding behind his eyes that only someone trained to notice would catch, and said, "I'll do it." She hadn't expected to actually like him. Getting close to Jiho hadn't been easy. His family, led by his formidable older sister, Mina Kang, who ran the company's PR and public image with an iron grip, had been suspicious of an American security contractor from the start, and doubly suspicious of a black woman inserted into their inner circle under the guise of an event consultant. Mina had interrogated Aveline personally in a boardroom in Seoul, her Korean-accented English clipped and precise. "You understand my brother's life depends on people believing you belong here," Mina said, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "Not just at the parties, in every room. If you are exposed as security, whoever is targeting him will simply wait until you're gone." "I understand," Aveline said. "Do you?" Mina leaned forward. Because if you fail, it will not just be my brother's life. It will be the company, 3,000 employees, my family's name. Do you understand what that weighs? Aveline held her gaze without flinching. I've protected men who had nothing to lose and men who had everything to lose. The weight doesn't change how I do my job. It just changes how much I care about getting it right. Something in Mina's expression had shifted then. Not quite trust, but the beginning of it. Jiho himself had been harder to win over. He was polite in the way that powerful men are polite to people they don't yet respect. Distant, formal, quick to end conversations. For the first month, he barely acknowledged Aveline beyond a nod, treating her like hired furniture that happened to attend the same events he did. It grated on her more than she wanted to admit. She told herself it didn't matter. She wasn't there to be liked. She was there to keep him alive. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you enjoy Afro-Korean stories filled with shocking twists and emotional endings, subscribe so you never miss the next episode. Now, let's get back to the moment that changed everything. The night everything cracked open was at a private dinner in Busan, 6 weeks into the assignment. Jiho had cornered her near the bar, a glass of soju in his hand, his tie loosened, his usual composure softened by alcohol and exhaustion. "You never smile," he'd said, studying her. "Not real ones. I've watched you all night. You smile with your mouth, but never your eyes." "Maybe I haven't seen anything worth smiling about," Aveline had answered. "That's sad," Jiho had said, and for the first time she'd heard something genuine in his voice, something unguarded. "You know, everyone around me smiles all the time. My board smiles, my investors smile, my own sister smiles when she wants something from me. I don't think I've had an honest conversation in years." "Is that a complaint or an invitation?" Aveline had asked, arching an eyebrow. Jiho had actually laughed then, a real laugh, surprised out of him. Maybe both. That had been the start of something neither of them planned for. Stolen conversations in hallways, late-night texts disguised as security check-ins, a growing ease between them that Aveline knew, with rising dread, was becoming dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with bullets. She was supposed to protect his life. She was not supposed to fall for the man attached to it. But the threats kept escalating, and there was no time to untangle her feelings from her job, because whoever wanted Jiho Kang dead wasn't slowing down. They were getting bolder. 2 weeks before the Yacht Gala, Aveline had intercepted a message on an encrypted channel she'd flagged from inside Kang Shipping's own security network, proof that Desmond's fears had been right. There was a mole, someone with access to Jiho's schedule, his security details, rotations, his private travel plans, someone close enough to know he'd be hosting an anniversary celebration aboard the Belle Horizon, off the coast of Jeju Island, surrounded by 200 of Asia's wealthiest guests, exactly the kind of chaotic, high-visibility event where a single well-placed shooter could vanish into a crowd before anyone even understood what happened. She'd gone to Jiho with the intel. He'd wanted to cancel the event. Mina had refused, insisting that canceling would signal weakness to the board right before a critical merger vote, that appearing afraid would do more damage to the company than any bullet could. Aveline had argued, pleaded, laid out every scenario where the open deck of a yacht became a kill box with nowhere to run. In the end, the party went forward, and Aveline had spent the 2 weeks leading up to it running counter-surveillance, vetting every name on the guest list twice, walking every inch of that yacht until she knew its blind spots better than the crew did. She still hadn't found the shooter, not until that night when she caught the faintest glint of light off the scope on the third deck, 40 seconds before Jiho would have been standing directly in the crosshairs, alone, toasting his family's 30th anniversary in shipping in front of the entire assembled elite of the Pacific Rim. 40 seconds. That was all the warning she'd had. So she'd done the only thing she could think of in that sliver of time. She'd grabbed him and started dancing, because a moving target surrounded by other moving bodies was the hardest shot a sniper could take, and because it was the only excuse she had that wouldn't cause 200 guests to panic and scatter into a stampede that might get someone else killed instead. 5 minutes, Jiho said, now spinning with her under the golden lights, his voice tight with fear he was struggling to hide. Why 5 minutes? Because that's how long it'll take my partner to get eyes on the shooter and neutralize the threat. Desmond is on the lower deck, posing as catering staff. He spotted the same glint I did. He's moving now. And if he doesn't make it in 5 minutes? Aveline's grip on his hand tightened just slightly. Then we keep dancing until he does. Jiho searched her face again, and this time, instead of disbelief, she saw something else. Trust, terrifying and total. The trust of a man who had decided in the space of 30 seconds that his life was safer in her hands than anywhere else on that yacht. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, tell me what to do." "Keep your eyes on me," Aveline said. "Not on the railing, not on the deck, just me. If you look up there, you'll tip him off that we know." Jiho held her gaze, and despite everything, the gun somewhere above them, the ticking clock, the 200 people who had no idea their host's life was hanging by a thread, Aveline felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been building for weeks and that she'd been refusing to name. 3 minutes, she murmured, guiding him into another slow turn, angling his body behind a cluster of dancing guests. Her earpiece crackled faintly, Desmond's voice, barely audible over the music. "I've got him. 3rd deck, behind the lifeboat housing. He's repositioning. Aveline, keep Jiho moving. Don't let him get a clean angle." "Copy," Aveline whispered. "What did he say?" Jiho asked, his voice barely above a breath. "He's found the shooter, but the shooter's repositioning, which means he might have made us." Aveline's mind raced through the yacht's layout, every exit, every choke point. "We need to get you off this deck, now." But as she said it, she saw it. A flicker of movement near the lifeboat housing, a barrel catching the light for a half heartbeat before disappearing again. Her training took over before conscious thought could. She shoved Jiho hard, sending him stumbling into a startled group of guests, and threw herself sideways as a muffled crack split the air. A sound so quiet under the music that only she and Desmond, over comms, understood what it meant. The bullet buried itself in the deck exactly where Jiho had been standing a half-second before. Chaos erupted, not from the gunshot, which most guests mistook for a champagne cork or a piece of falling equipment, but from the sudden, visible violence of a woman in an emerald gown throwing a billionaire to the ground and covering his body with her own. Screams started rippling outward. Drastics dropped trays. Somewhere, a woman was crying out for security. "Stay down," Aveline growled into Jiho's ear, her body a shield over her as she scanned the deck. "Stay down, don't move." "Aveline," Jiho's voice cracked, fear finally breaking through the composure he'd clung to. "Aveline, what's happening?" "Second shooter," Desmond's voice snapped over comms, breathless, running. "There's 2 of them. I've got the first one pinned, but there's a second position, starboard side. I don't have eyes." Aveline's blood went cold. 2 shooters meant this wasn't opportunistic. This was coordinated, funded, planned by someone who understood exactly how much firepower it would take to guarantee a kill on a moving, protected target. This was someone inside Kang Shipping who knew Jiho's security posture intimately enough to plan around it. "Jiho," Aveline said, hauling him up by the arm, keeping her body angled between him and the starboard railing as she half-dragged him toward the interior of the yacht. "I need you to run, not walk, run. The moment we're inside, we find your sister and we get you both to the panic room in the lower deck. Do you understand me?" "There's a panic room?" Jiho gasped, stumbling to keep pace with her as she shoved through fleeing guests, her eyes cutting across every window, every doorway, every shadow that could be hiding a second shooter. "Every yacht this size has one. Your security team should have briefed you." Aveline's jaw tightened, "which means someone made sure you were never told." They burst through the double doors into the yacht's grand salon, where Mina Kang stood frozen amid a crush of fleeing guests, her face white with shock, her eyes searching wildly until they landed on her brother. "Jiho!" Mina rushed forward, grabbing his face in her hands, checking him for wounds with the frantic urgency of someone who had spent months dreading exactly this moment. "It's not mine," Aveline said quickly, glancing down at the small graze along her own arm, where she'd hit the deck hard enough to tear skin. "We need to move, now. There's a second shooter still active." Mina's eyes snapped at Aveline, and for the first time since they'd met, there was no suspicion in them at all, only raw, desperate gratitude, and beneath it, dawning horror. It's someone inside. It has to be. No one outside the family knew we'd moved the panic room briefing to next week. "We'll figure out who," Aveline said, already moving them toward the stairwell that led below deck. "Right now, survival first, questions after." The panic room was a reinforced compartment beneath the yacht's engine room, accessible only through a coded door that Mina's trembling fingers barely managed to unlock. Once inside, with the heavy door sealed and the muffled screams of the party fading into silence, Jiho finally allowed himself to break, sinking onto the floor, his hands shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I could have died," he said, staring at nothing. "Up there, dancing, I could have actually died." "You didn't," Aveline said, crouching in front of him, her voice softening for the first time all night. "I wasn't going to let that happen." "Why?" Jiho looked up at her, and the question wasn't rhetorical, it was raw, searching. "Because somewhere between Busan and tonight," she said quietly, "you stopped being a client to me." The silence that followed was heavy, charged, interrupted only by the static crackle of Desmond's voice returning to her earpiece. "Aveline, first shooter is in custody. Second one's been neutralized. He's alive, but he's not talking yet. I've got local authorities inbound. And Aveline," Desmond's voice dropped, grim, "you're going to want to see who the second shooter's handler is. We pulled his phone. There's a contact labeled M." Aveline's stomach dropped. She looked up, saw Mina's face go rigid, saw the horrible dawning realization pass between the siblings like a current. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you enjoy Afro-Korean stories filled with shocking twists and emotional endings, subscribe so you never miss the next episode. Now, let's get back to the moment that changed everything. "Not me," Mina said instantly, her voice cracking with panic. "Jiho, you have to believe me, it's not—" "Minho," Jiho said suddenly, his voice hollow. "Minho Seo, our head of logistics. He goes by M with the board. He's had access to my schedule for 6 years." It took another hour and a very tense conversation with Jeju Island's maritime police before the full picture emerged. Minho Seo, trusted for over a decade, had been quietly siphoning shipping contracts to a rival conglomerate for the past 3 years, and when Jiho's board had begun auditing logistics spending, Minho had panicked, certain that exposure was only weeks away. Killing Jiho wouldn't have saved the company he'd have inherited leadership of by default, but it would have bought him enough chaos and delay to disappear with what he'd already stolen. By the time the sun rose over the water, the Belle Horizon sat anchored under the watch of 2 police vessels, its golden lights long since dimmed, its dance floor littered with abandoned champagne glasses, and the wreckage of what should have been a celebration. Jiho stood at the railing, wrapped in a blanket someone had given him, staring out at the pale morning sky. Aveline found him there after giving her third statement to the authorities, her emerald gown replaced by a borrowed jacket, the graze on her arm bandaged. "You saved my life tonight. Twice, actually, if we're counting properly, the dancing and then the shove." "I did my job," Aveline said, coming to stand beside him. "Don't," Jiho said suddenly, his voice hollow. "Don't reduce it to a job, not after what you said in that panic room." Aveline's throat tightened. "Jiho, I'm your security contractor. Whatever this is, it's not exactly professional." "I don't care about professional," Jiho said, taking a step closer, his voice quiet but certain. Aveline, I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from my name, my money, my position. Tonight, a woman threw her own body between me and a bullet, and in the middle of the worst 5 minutes of my life, the only thing I could think about was whether you were safe too. That's not a client's fear. That's not gratitude. I know what that is. Jiho, I'm not asking you to stay because I need protection. I'm asking you to stay because these past 6 weeks have been the only honest ones I can remember having with anyone. Because you make me laugh in rooms where I forgot laughter was allowed. Because for the first time, I don't want the party to end just so I can keep talking to you. Aveline felt the last of her professional resolve crumbling. 6 weeks of carefully maintained distance dissolving in the pale morning light. Your sister's going to have a lot to say about this, she said, but there was warmth in it now, not resistance. My sister already likes you more than she's ever liked anyone I've dated, Jiho said, a small, exhausted smile breaking through. She told me last week she thought you were the first person who ever looked at me like a person instead of a company. She's not wrong, Aveline admitted. Jiho reached for her hand, the same hand he'd been gripping on the dance floor less than 12 hours earlier, when 5 minutes had felt like an eternity balanced on the edge of a blade. He said, "Then stay," simply, not as my security, as mine. 6 months later, the Belle Horizon set sail again, this time under considerably lighter circumstances, repainted, re-blessed by the crew who'd insisted on it after the trauma of that night, and decorated for an engagement celebration instead of a company anniversary. Mina had planned the entire event herself, determined to reclaim the yacht from the memory of violence and turn it into something joyful instead. Desmond stood near the bar, uncharacteristically dressed in a proper suit instead of catering blacks, grinning as he watched his business partner across the deck. Aveline stood in the center of the dance floor in a gown the color of deep gold, laughing as Jiho spun her under strings of lights that finally felt safe instead of ominous. Minho Seo and his second shooter were both awaiting trial, the rival conglomerate's involvement fully exposed, Kang Shipping's board more secure than it had been in years, largely thanks to the transparency Jiho had insisted on in the aftermath, refusing to let his family paper over what had nearly cost him his life. "Any snipers tonight?" Jiho murmured against her ear as they danced, half joking. "Just Desmond, watching us like a proud, overprotective older brother," Aveline said, glancing toward the bar where Desmond raised his glass to them with an exaggerated wink. "Good," Jiho said, pulling her closer. "Then I think this is the first dance we've ever had where nobody's life was actually in danger." "Don't jinx it," Aveline teased, but her smile was easy, unguarded, the kind she hadn't worn in years before this man walked into her life wrapped in danger and, impossibly, in love. Jiho laughed, the real laugh, the one she'd first heard in Busan, the one that had started unraveling every wall she'd built to keep clients at arm's length. "Aveline Cole, 6 months ago, you grabbed me on this exact deck and told me to dance with you or die in 5 minutes. Best terrible pickup line I've ever heard." "It wasn't a pickup line," Aveline said, grinning. "It was a threat assessment." "Well," Jiho said, spinning her once more beneath the golden lights, the ring on her finger catching the light exactly the way the sniper's scope once had. Only this time it meant everything was finally beautifully safe. And on the deck of the Belle Horizon, under a sky full of stars instead of shadows, the woman who had once saved his life with a lie about 5 minutes stayed in his arms for the rest of the night, and, as it turned out, for every night after that.